welcome back to the Word Room. We are going chapter by chapter through the whole Bible, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. In this chapter, we see Laban attempt to trick Jacob again, and we see fighting amongst sisters. Let's go. All right, let's jump right into our summary of Genesis chapter 30. In this chapter, Rachel, who married Jacob, who Jacob loved and worked for 14 years for Rachel, is jealous of her sister for having sons for Jacob. So she allows her maid to sleep with Jacob to give her children. They would be Rachel's children, but born to her maid, which is almost like a surrogate situation. Rachel's maid has 2 sons with Jacob, and then Leah realizes she's no longer conceiving. So being jealous, she offers her maid to Jacob to have more children for Leah. Leah's maid has 2 sons with Jacob, but then through a series of events, Leah ends up having more children with Jacob, and she conceives 2 more sons for Jacob and a daughter with him. And then Rachel finally has a child of her own with Jacob, a son that she names Joseph. After this story of the sisters fighting back and forth and Jacob having more children, we get to the second part of this chapter, which tells the story of Laban trying to trick Jacob again. So Jacob knew it was time for him to go back to the land of Canaan. He had been with Laban in that land for well over 14 years at this point. It was now time for him to go back to the land that God had promised him. So he was going to go back to Canaan. He requests to leave, but Laban wants him to stay. So Jacob works out this deal where he offers to shepherd Laban's flock a little bit longer if Laban lets him have all the speckled sheep and goats, and Laban would keep the solid color ones. Laban tried to trick Jacob. We'll look at exactly how that happened in just a moment. But in that process, God blessed Jacob, and Jacob ended up with plenty of sheep and the majority of the sheep as God blessed him. So let's look at the 5 takeaways from this chapter. Number 1, in the previous chapter, Leah had 4 sons with Jacob. We saw that at the end of chapter 29. In this chapter, Jacob has 7 more sons and a daughter, bringing the number of children to 11 sons and 1 daughter. So he has 11 sons and 1 daughter. In the last chapter, he had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. In this chapter, all of those, by the way, in the last chapter were by Leah. In this chapter, we see that he has a couple of children through Rachel's maid, 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Then we see that Leah's maid produces 2 sons for Jacob, that is Gad and Asher. Then we see Leah conceives 3 more children, 2 of which Issachar and Zebulun were sons, and Dinah was a daughter. And then we see Rachel finally have the last son that we see in this chapter, which was Joseph. Now, what we see in this chapter is that it details the conflict between Leah and Rachel and shows that while God had called Jacob, Jacob wasn't a perfect man, nor did his family live perfectly. We see this again. We've seen this with Abraham. We saw it with Isaac. We see it with Noah. We can go all the way back to Adam. Over and over and over, we see that God uses imperfect people. They were not perfect. Jacob was not perfect. His family was not perfect. And we see that polygamy and concubines were not God's design or plan. They just lead to problems for Jacob. And we kind of see this throughout Scripture. You'll hear a lot of people question, well, why were the people that, in the Old Testament allowed to be polygamists? And why were they? They weren't allowed to. At this point, there is no God-given law, right? The law hadn't come down. But as far as even after the law, when we see polygamy, that wasn't God's design. It wasn't what God intended. It's just a reality of what happened. And the Bible, again, is a lot of times descriptive, describing what happened, and not prescriptive, prescribing a way to live. So some things are prescriptive, they tell us how to live. Some things are just simply describing what happened, and that's this case. It was describing what happened, but the Bible makes it clear This wasn't the plan of God. We see that in Adam and Eve, and it did nothing but cause problems. God did not design us for polygamy and concubines and sleeping with other people other than our spouses. This was never God's intention. Now God used it to bring about the nation of Israel in the context of these children being born, but it wasn't his design. It wasn't his plan. They made choices, and God used those choices to bring about his ultimate will, even though they were making choices that weren't good or right for their family or for Jacob or for his wife. So again, this was not the plan or purpose of God. Jacob agreed with Laban after all this with the sisters. As we looked at earlier, Jacob makes an agreement to watch Laban's sheep longer before he left to go back to Canaan. They agreed that Jacob would keep all of the sheep that were born speckled, which just means they have patches of multiple colors, while Laban would keep all of the sheep that had solid colors. This was Jacob's idea, and it was almost a plan. It was almost like a payment for him continuing to stay a little bit longer to watch the sheep. But Laban, after agreeing to this decision, immediately tries to trick Jacob and cheat him out of the sheep. So what he did is he took all the speckled sheep, all the sheep that had patches, and he took them away from the flock and put them, hid them about a 3-day journey away from where Jacob was. And that way Jacob couldn't allow the flock to intermingle with like all that would be basically mating would be the solid color sheep, and therefore solid color sheep would be the only sheep that was born. Was Laban's attempt. He thought, oh well, we'll do that, and that way he has no sheep to take with him, and hopefully try to trick him into staying, because it has not happened. So he's going to delay leaving. That was the ultimate goal of Laban. So just like Jacob had previously been a trickster, Laban was as well, and we saw that with Rachel and Leah. So what we actually find out is that God had actually given Jacob instructions in a dream. We don't find this out till the next chapter, in chapter 31. But God had given instructions to Jacob in a dream, which led to Jacob being blessed with most of the sheep, specifically the strong sheep. So it was God who told Jacob to make this deal with the speckled sheep. It was God who likely gave him the instructions specifically to put out the sticks and to do the different things. Not necessarily that it was the sticks or anything like that that actually caused speckled sheep to be born, but rather it was God who was controlling it and causing the speckled sheep to be born. But God was doing it through an act of obedience to put out the sticks and to see if Jacob would obey and follow his instructions. Just like with Abraham had to follow the instructions with Isaac. So this chapter tells us 5 things about God. Number 1, God is merciful. Through the entire process, Jacob is sleeping with people that's not his spouse. He's caught in polygamy. He's going back and forth with these 2 women. There's fighting between the women. Jacob's kind of caught in the middle of all of this. It's just so much chaos and absolute sin and all kinds of things going on. And God, in his mercy, still brought about the children that would ultimately, that we're going to find out as we keep going through scripture, become the 12 tribes of Israel and the formation of this nation of Israel. So God has promised a country, a nation, a land, and God is bringing that about in his mercy, even while they are all messed up in sin. And again, we see this throughout the scripture. You're going to hear this over and over through these videos. God is merciful. We also see that he's a God who blesses. That God blessed Jacob. Jacob had, even though he wasn't living perfect, he had definitely had some encounters with God that have changed him slightly. And as he continues to seek God, as he continues to move in the will of God, as he continues to want to go back to the land of Canaan, right? He wants to go back to the promised land. He wants to follow the promise of God. Even though he's not living perfect, he wants to follow the promise of God. He is being blessed by God. God is a God who blesses. That doesn't mean that you're going to have everything you want. It doesn't mean if you want $1 million, you're going to get $1 million. What it does mean, however, is that God is with you, and God is a good father, and God will take care of you. We also see that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. He is over his plan, his will, he is in control of all of this. Even though the specific actions being taken are not actions he designed or wanted. It's not actions that he would told them to do. It's not things that he approves of. His will is still coming to pass, even in their sin. God is big enough. He is so big that he can bring about his will and his plan even through your mistakes and through your failures. That you are not big enough to knock God off his throne. God will bring about his plan and his will because he is sovereign, but he is so big that he can do it through your free will. We also see that God has power over nature. He is able to control and dictate the birth of these sheep and bring about specific type of sheep for Jacob, as we see in the next chapter. Again, he's the one who commanded all of this. So God is able to have power over nature and to be able to control nature. God is outside of creation and he is able to work within creation. Very important about God. And finally, we see that God speaks to us. We see that specifically in the next chapter, but we see that God spoke to Jacob. God spoke to Jacob in order to have this specific plan come to place for the sheep. God spoke to him in a dream. God speaks to us. Very, very important. 5 things we learned about God. I hope you dig a little deeper in this chapter. Seek God. Comment down below. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next time.